Okay, let's get right to the program now. I want to introduce our speaker. He is a digital strategist. He is a futurist, and he calls himself a micro farmer. Not really sure what that is, so I'm gonna have to ask him that. He's from Eastern Ontario, and his passion is to collaborate and educate people on the benefits and the perils of technology. And I think he's got a pretty good handle on the difference between tools and toys when it comes to new technology. So it's my pleasure at this time to welcome Jesse Hirsh. Hey, Jesse.
How you doing, Kevin?
Well, how do you define a micro farmer? How's that work?
Well, it's someone who's starting off small. I'm relatively new to the agricultural sector in the sense that I wasn't born into it, but my heart
Okay.
is nonetheless leading me there. That's where maybe you spoke a little too far. I can't always tell the difference between tech and toys. I try to make sure that that Venn diagram overlaps quite a bit. But
Okay.
it's my curiosity, I think, if anything, that's brought me here.
All right. Well, Jesse, the virtual floor is yours. We look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you very much. And, really, my background is in technology and in looking at the internet. And it's about 5 years ago that I decided that the future of technology was in agriculture, that really the exciting and the opportunities when it comes to not just learning, but innovating, being part of successful businesses could be found in agriculture. And part of my expertise, part of my background is in the technology sector, is in trying to understand how to translate, how to decipher, how to demystify technology so that it can empower people. So I want to talk today about how to digitize your farm, but also why, and how to digitize your farm on your terms so that it serves your business interests, so that it serves your personal interests. And really, if we were to start in terms of thinking about digitizing your farm, well, maybe the first question is, do you have a digital barn? I mean, if you think about the way in which an agricultural operation organizes its assets, you've got a barn for your animals, you got a drive shed for your equipment, you might have other buildings to support different endeavors you're into. Well, what about your digital infrastructure? Have you thought about the way in which you organize and secure your data? Have you thought about the way in which you protect and develop and maintain your technology? I mean, on the one hand, part of what we'll talk about today is literacy in terms of having the skills and proficiencies to make sure that you use the tool rather than the tool using you. But on the other hand, we want to anticipate the future of agriculture because one of the arguments in favor of having a digital barn is for your increasing cash crop of data. Now, not all farmers realize that they're raising data and they're harvesting data, and that, like some other cash crops, there's a lot of value to data, especially if you're organizing and maintaining and having the capacity to deal with your data. So that's why it's important, both metaphorically and literally, to think about your computer infrastructure as a digital barn, both so that you can maintain ownership and control of that data, but also so that as agriculture starts to become more digitized, as new equipment, new services, new markets start to emerge, that you'll not only have the data to participate profitably, but have the data to actually participate in the first place. Because whether it's traceability, whether it's training machine learning models, or whether it's just social media as a marketing platform, increasingly agriculture is just as data driven as any other industry, and you want to be in control of your data most of all. So that's why I like the metaphor of a digital barn in terms of thinking about your capacity, thinking about your technical equipment, and thinking about your future in terms of the investments you're making to make sure that you're both sustainable and profitable moving forward. Now, unfortunately, that means we have to start with the 800-pound elephant in the room, which is your internet connection. I mean, I almost want to say, raise your digital hand if your internet connection is terrible. And 2 days ago, that was me. I was having a really horrible time with my country internet, wireless. And in fact, when we did some of the tech checks for this event, my connection cut out multiple times. So the organizers actually had to factor in, what do we do if Jesse completely disappears right in the middle of the presentation? Thankfully, due to months and months of effort, I now have fiber connectivity. But this is a problem a lot of farmers face, partly because the internet has always favored cities rather than rural communities. And many rural communities, especially places that have large farms, the major providers, they just don't want to serve the few people who would be their customers. So even though you hear a lot about the future of agriculture being in the cloud, being driven by technology, you have to have the on-ramp to the information superhighway to get there in the first place. And unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that that may be up to you. That perhaps your first step in towards being having a digital barn or digitizing your farm is to think about your internet connection. So I've got two success stories, two inspiring stories to share with you that give examples of how farmers have organized their own internet. Now, the first is this Catalonian or Spanish group called Guifi.net. And Guifi.net, they're just sort of up here in the corner if you want to Google them or check their logo later. They were a bunch of farmers in rural Spain who realized that the future of agriculture was online, and they decided to start doing their own fiber infrastructure. So they literally started running fiber optics from one farm to the next so that they could have fast speed, so they could share data amongst themselves, so they could share video amongst themselves. But when they wanted to get a cheap uplink connection, what they did was stage protests, which they do a lot in Spain. But imagine a Friday afternoon and cottage season when everyone wants to leave.
Okay, it looks like Jesse has, is there a lot of irony in this discussion or what? Have you noticed that? Just as we're talking about connectivity, Jesse goes into lock mode. And anyway, we're going to wait and see if he can reconnect. But in the meantime, what I want to do is to highlight something that, oh, he's waving, he's back. Hey, are you connected again? We're just laughing about the irony of what you were talking about.
As the karmic nature of the universe, isn't it? That the moment you evoke the possibility, it happens. Yes. Granted, I've had this fiber connection for about 12 hours now, so clearly there. And if we have time, I can even share how it happened. But the idea is no other company's going to provide it for yourself. I mean, Guifi.net staged tractor protests in which they took over highways to demand rural connectivity. Another great example is called Barn, B4RN, or Broadband for the Rural North. They're actually one of the fastest internet companies in the world, and they're a cooperative owned by farmers who in rural northern England decided that if no one was going to bring their internet, they could do it themselves. And they've actually created resources and templates for other farmers to create their own internet co-ops. I'm in Eastern Ontario, and we also have pretty craptacular internet here. And so some friends of mine at Community Fiber actually work to connect fiber. And one of the reasons it's kind of sketchy is it's actually run in the ditch on the side of the road, because we didn't have time to run it on hydro poles and get proper permitting. So you do what you got to do. And it recognizes that the internet, when it comes to rural communities, is kind of sketchy, but it can be done. And this is where there's a lot of resources available. So I only offer this to say that I acknowledge your pain. I still experience the same pain, but it is essential to not wait for companies to set you up, but to figure out how you and your neighbors can set each other up. Because a lot of what you hear about is the technology. And here's a very brief example of a company called Ubiquiti. Ubiquiti.com or UI.com is really cheap and affordable networking gear that you can set up on your own property so that you have Wi-Fi in all your fields, in all your buildings. You can even set it up so that you share between neighbors, and you're able, if one person has fiber connection, to bounce it off to wireless connection. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about how Ubiquiti works, but if I'm going to tell you that you could build your own internet, I might as well point you to the equipment manufacturer who actually provides affordable gear so that you can create literally your own internet networks, whether on your own property, whether on the properties you rent, or whether throughout your region and throughout your neighborhood. Because you do hear a lot about cloud computing. And most of what we think about in terms of precision agriculture and digitizing the farm, it kind of depends upon you having a really fast internet connection. Because the cloud is a fancy word to say someone else's computers way out there elsewhere. Now, here's where I will, tip my hat to places like the University of Saskatchewan, who are working on different cloud computing models that serve agricultural and rural communities. Allow me to briefly tell you about something called Edge Cloud. And edge cloud is the idea that rather than go to the cloud, you bring the cloud to your property. And this is what I had to do the last 2 years when my internet was terrible. Because I still wanted to have video surveillance, I still wanted to have sensors, I still wanted to have all sorts of technology on my small and modest farm. So I made sure that none of it went to the internet, that all of it stayed on my property. So instead of saturating my internet connection, my network video recorder that recorded all my video footage, that analyzed all my video footage, that sits in my digital barn on my property. I don't have to worry about, say, when my kid has a Zoom call, or I have to worry about when someone is using the internet. All my agricultural data per traffic stays on my property, and that I've built my own mini cloud, or what's called an edge cloud, because it's literally on the edge in terms of the edge of the internet. And so for people who have crappy internet, for people who have slow internet, satellite internet, edge cloud provides an option that still allows you to use all the technology, that still allows you to embrace the kind of bleeding edge of ag automation without necessarily being cut off or slowed down by a terrible internet connection. Don't get me wrong, a high-speed internet connection is worth the investment, but if for whatever reason it's not possible, at least in the here and now, take a look at edge cloud and the way in which you can create your own infrastructure on your own property as a way of still experiencing the best of what's available. Now, a lot of it, or at least the basic level, is just surveillance. And this is an example of the surveillance, the video surveillance that I have set up for my property. It's using Ubiquiti or Unify Gear, and all of it was local. So none of these video feeds were going into the cloud. None of them were going onto my internet connection, but we're still able to monitor our property and monitor our animals 24/7. Now, thankfully, as we mentioned, my internet connection has been improved in the last 12 hours. So I now can sort of show, the way in which this internet can be done in real time. And I will briefly refresh this in hopes that it works. And yes, here in real time, you can see my coop. There's our turkey and some of our guinea hens and some of our chickens. So this allowed us to sort of monitor the coop within the house, or, similarly, we monitor our goats and sort of see what they're up to and see how they're eating. So on the one hand, it gives you peace of mind. Certainly in the case of my wife, it meant that, she didn't have to always go outside, especially when it's cold. She could monitor and sort of see how their hay bags were and how they were feeding. The other interesting part is that animals behave differently when humans aren't around. So it's shown us different dynamics, for example, in terms of the flock, in terms of who was being bullied or who needed extra attention or who was maybe getting sick. So, on a basic level, video surveillance, especially if you have livestock, can really go a long way towards minimizing the amount of time you need to go out and check on the animals. But this is also a source of data. There's all sorts of different software that can allow you to automatically analyze those animals, pick up when they're sick, pick up when they're starting to get sick. There's this chicken robot company that analyzes chicken droppings and can actually tell by the colorings of the chicken droppings whether those chickens are going to be sick, sometimes 5-6 days ahead of when the farmer normally would. So video surveillance, once you have connectivity, once you have, say, Wi-Fi to your barn, it's a very basic step in terms of gathering data and experiencing some smart farm technology. And of course, there's monitoring your equipment from a security perspective, as well as monitoring some of the different aspects of your property. But, here's another interesting example of a monitoring solution that's not video, but sensor-based. Telesense is a grain monitoring company where they build a different range of monitors that can monitor, say, the level within a grain, the moisture level, whether there's rot, whether there's pests. And this sort of illustrates the value of data. Because when you're collecting surveillance, it's not just about the data in and of itself, but the way in which that data can train predictive models, or the way in which that data can create AI that might, for example, in the case of a grain silo, anticipate the conditions in which rot may take place, or anticipate the conditions in which a fan might break, or an auger might break. And so in being able to monitor and being able to surveil and gather data, it allows you to be more responsive. It allows you even to anticipate problems before they arise. And that's where there's a growing ecosystem of companies and technologies and providers that make it relatively easy for you to monitor the things that matter most to you. And the idea on a basic surveillance level is to allow you to focus your attention on the real problems. Because there's lots of really monotonous aspects of farming in terms of just checking on the animals, checking on the equipment, the crops, waiting for the grain to unload. That if you could have technology doing that for you, or if you could do it remotely from your phone, from your house, from your office, that might make things a little easier. And it's not just companies like Telesense. I mean, here in my hand, I have something called a Raspberry Pi. And a Raspberry Pi is a really cheap microcomputer. I mean, they range in size. The Pi Zero costs $10. This is a Pi 3. It costs about $35, $40. And the Pi 4, I think, is now upwards of $50. But these are full-featured computers. They do everything a computer could do, except for the fact that they're cheap and they're small. And it's easy to buy sensors that can attach to them and gather data. So you could have a humidity sensor or a soil moisture sensor or a temperature sensor all built into one. So whether you have a greenhouse or whether you want to keep tabs on problematic parts of your field or different aspects of your barn or your coop or other animal quarters, you can actually build this stuff fairly cheaply and then start gathering that data on your own. Because on the one hand, Telesense, well, they don't really want you to gather that data. They're gathering that data for them because they're the ones who are turning that data into valuable products. Versus if you were to use your own technology and gather that data for yourself, well, you could start building your own AI models. You could start building your own automation models. And before you say, well, Jesse, that's pretty crazy. Well, guess what? There's a lot of tutorials. There's a lot of free stuff out there that would allow you to build it. But I'll come back to that in a bit. Really, what I'm trying to get when we think about this notion of surveillance is that it enables, it opens doors, and it connects to future technology in terms of where agriculture is headed. But so far, we've just been talking about basic surveillance. Because, the wild part of surveillance is drones. And the way in which drones allow for a much more nuanced, a much more granular level of surveillance. This is DJI's latest agricultural drone. DJI is the Chinese drone manufacturer who is above and beyond the global drone leader. And what's fascinating about the drones, this is a dedicated agricultural drone, but you could get their Mavic Mini, which last I checked sells for about 400 Canadian dollars. And it will allow you to map your fields and build the types of ornithographic analysis that allows you to look at vegetation health, soil moisture. I mean, it's really quite remarkable that just collecting the images from a bird's eye view then allows those images to be analyzed in increasingly powerful ways. For example, I use this software called Open Drone Map, and it's free and open source, so anyone can use it. And it takes imagery collected by any drone and then builds really sophisticated models, in many cases 3D models of your crops, of your fields, even of your buildings, that again allows you to do all sorts of different analysis, allows you to share that data with different partners. And that speaks to how this data really creates all sorts of additional opportunities, whether that's precision agriculture in terms of the way in which you farm, or whether that's being able to remotely work with an agronomist or remotely work with other partners, or if you're engaged in contract farming to demonstrate to your clients that you're engaging in the practices they expect. And I'll come back to that transparency point. But what's interesting about drones is the way in which they make surveillance really easy, because you're literally just flying around. And that allows you, whether your fields are spread out over a large area, to just bring the drone in the tractor or bring the drone in the truck, to be able to regularly do scheduled flights, to monitor your crops over time, especially given the volatile weather we've been seeing. So it's not just surveillance in terms of CCTV, it's portable surveillance in terms of what drones provide. But of course, the other aspect of drones is that they're robots. And we think of drones on the one hand as surveillance, but they also usher in a new era of robotic technology. And one of the benefits of drones in that because a drone can map out your field, the same way that a lot of latest farm equipment can, you can then share those maps with other robots. You can share those maps with other equipment. And the more detailed that map, the more nuanced that map, the more informed those other robots or that other machinery may be. So you end up in this kind of feedback loop in which you need data to train the robot. The robot collects data or harvests data from your land, which is then used to train the robot and improve it. And that's where you have to pause and say, is the DJI drone working for you? Or are you working for the DJI drone? How much is DJI benefiting from the data that it's harvesting from your farm to train its robot to be more effective and have more features? And to what extent are you harnessing those features and making the most of what that robot can offer? Now, interestingly enough, it's the dairy industry that is the most advanced when it comes to robotics. And this is true both in terms of the robots that are available, but it's also true in terms of dairy farmers. That if you're a dairy farmer, you're far more likely to already have robots working for you on this farm than almost anyone else working in the agricultural sector. Now, this big robot here, this is where I may not pronounce it correctly. Leli. This is Leli's Exos robot, and this is their new pasture-based robot. The idea that it'll bring fresh grass to the cows in the parlor by going out into the field, harvesting that grass in real time, and then bringing it back into the parlor and feeding that fresh grass to the cow. So on the one hand, this is an attempt to further expand the company's range of robots and services that they provide, but it's also meant to be able to provide fresh pasture grass to the cows who would otherwise not be free ranging. But there's a whole bunch of data questions that come up with this thing. You know, the quality of the grass, the health of the grass, the quality of the soil. I mean, certainly from the company's perspective, it allows them to cast a wider net in terms of the data that they're collecting. But it also speaks to the way in which these types of robots are starting to expand more and more in terms of the type of data that they can collect and the types of roles that they would play in a farm. So it's an opportunity for the robot company, but it's also an opportunity for the farmer if and when they're able to share that data. The same way that you might be collecting data about your cows, you might find it interesting to also collect data about your pastures or about the food that they're eating and correlate that to their health or correlate that to the quality of milk. There are many people who might be thinking that's overkill. I'm not interested in that data. But perhaps the consumer or the buyer of the milk might be interested in that data. But we'll come back to that in a bit. Because part of what we're starting to touch upon now is philosophy. Because robots are not just about, farming as if farming is done the same everywhere. No, different farmers have different philosophies. Different consumers have different philosophies about which products they buy. And so that's where if we start to think about data, if we start to think about robots, we start to think about the digital farm, well, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of your technology? What's the purpose of your digital operation? If it's just to make more money, okay, cool, I get that. Then that might be one way to approach, say, increased productivity, increased efficiency. But what if sustainability? What if value add? What if making more money for the products you were making was part of your motivation? That's where philosophy makes a big difference. Now, of course, John Deere is a giant when it comes to agriculture, and they're certainly one of the leaders when it comes to robotics and technology and data. So this is an example of John Deere's precision agriculture in terms of their Blue River technology. And this is an example of a robot attachment. Because even though John Deere is making robot tractors, this is an attachment that does not necessarily require an automated tractor because the attachment itself is automated. It uses image processing and artificial intelligence to only apply pesticides exactly where they're needed. So it goes over a field and identifies every single plant growing on the field. And then using its growing database of weeds, it can identify what it should be spraying and what it should not be spraying. So, on the one hand, this can dramatically lower input costs in terms of the chemicals that you're going to have to buy. It can also dramatically increase your yield and your overall efficiency because you're only spraying the areas that need it. And similarly, you can apply the same logic to nutrients and other inputs that are needed to get the greatest yield. So that way, instead of treating a field as if it's just one big, single canvas, you could instead paint a masterpiece. You can instead use the very specific brush strokes on each and every crop and each and every part of the field to achieve this real desire of precision agriculture. So in John Deere's vision, what they're offering is a path towards sustainability that really minimizes the role of pesticides, but it also acknowledges the fact that weeds are really starting to adapt and really starting to move forward. But nonetheless, it also speaks to how it might be the attachment and not the tractor that needs the data. And further, the amount of data that this attachment is generating is tremendous. And of course, it benefits John Deere, it benefits Blue River because it allows them to further train the accuracy and the diversity of their database to identify different types of weeds, to identify as these weeds start to evolve. But of course, that's just one philosophy. That's just one approach. Here's another company, Neo Technologies. And Neo Technologies is a French-based robotics company. They've got 3 different robots. This is their latest called Dino. And they actually do have a dealer here in Canada, in Quebec. So these robots are now starting to appear on Canadian fields. But this is a similar type of approach, but instead of it being an attachment, instead of it being a tractor, it's kind of a hybrid of both. In that this is a dedicated weeding machine that uses AI and machine learning, but instead of applying pesticides, it uses essentially a little blade. So it's tilling up very modestly the soil. It's cutting down the weed as it grows across the field. So it's another way of, in this case, eliminating pesticides while still trying to produce the greatest yield and eliminate any weeds in the field. But these types of robots are much cheaper than some of the other examples, and they're much more mission specific. But the idea here is they still depend data. Each of these robots would require a custom map of your field. They'd have to be able to identify which crops or which types of weeds you would be facing. Obviously, different parts of the country, different climates, different biomes have different weeds they'd have to produce. So right now, this technology works great in France where it's been developed, but how would it work in Alberta? How would it work in the lower mainland of British Columbia? We won't know until farmers actually use this technology on their fields. So it once again reinforces the idea that data is a prerequisite for being able to access this type of technology. But given the labor shortages that the agricultural sector has always faced, but especially as a result of this pandemic, having access to this kind of robotic technology can be really kind of appealing. And you can start to understand the opportunities, both when it comes to profitability, but also when it comes to scale of being able to manage larger farms, larger acreage with the same amount of labor because you're able to automate a lot of the menial tasks and free up the human being to focus on the creative problem solving, to focus on the more interesting tasks, and to focus on how you expand your business and diversify your revenues. Now, all the robots I've shown you so far are still relatively large. I mean, what's interesting is when you get into a whole paradigm shift in robotics, and that's this company, smallrobotcompany.com. And they're a British robotics company that's currently active in a couple of hundred British farms. And what they're producing is a fleet of tiny robots. And when I say tiny, I don't mean microscopic, but I mean like lawnmower tiny rather than, some of the larger agricultural equipment we're used to. But what's interesting about their robots is that they're designed to communicate with each other, right? The robot that's spraying will communicate to the robot that might de-weed, And they're getting their information from the robot that did the seeding originally, which is different from the robot that has the analysis and mapping software. So rather than have one big expensive robot, they have a suite of much more affordable robots that teach each other. Because again, they acknowledge that in order for these robots to be effective, in order for them to be powerful, they need these robots to be learning from each other, to be harvesting data and training each other when it comes to what they look for. And what I like about this model is it's a little bit of checks and balances. It's a little bit of each robot sort of checking each other's work, which then makes it easier for there to be mistakes. Because that's the other sort of background to this, is that you can expect that robots do make a lot of mistakes when it comes to the way in which they start to learn your land. And that's where the farmer kind of needs that digital barn, needs that digital perspective to make sure that they themselves can have the quality assurance. They themselves can measure that the robot is performing the way that you would expect. Now, I learned a lot of this stuff from an event I attended last week, the International Forum of Agricultural Robotics, which is hosted by Neo Technologies in France. Turns out in France, especially in southern France, in Toulouse, they've got quite a cluster of agricultural robotics going on, and the government is subsidizing and funding development in a very ambitious way. So if you're interested, next December, check out the International Forum on Agricultural Robotics, which, like this December, will be virtual. So if you're not able to travel because you're a farmer who has to tend to your farm every day, you can still connect virtually. But this is one of the slides that was put out by a company called ID Tech X. And unfortunately, it's not super legible because of the nature of how Zoom works. So if you send me an email or you post a form on my website, I'd be happy to send you a copy. But it kind of shows the way in which the agricultural value chain is being transformed by technology. That it used to be, the farmer just had labor, equipment, feed, water, seeds, crop protection, chemicals, so on and so forth. And that was it. And that's how they ran their farm. But increasingly, you'll notice this part on the right. That's the whole world of agricultural technology, from robots to precision sprayers to geolocation and auto steer and imaging and data analytics, all data driven. And so this is where your data cash crop gets its real value. That this entire ecosystem depends upon data from farmers to build their products. Either they're going to not tell you and just sort of, lie through omission and not mention how essential your data is to their business model, or they will be honest and provide some type of deal or create some type of relationship, or just like you would have, grain silos in which you stockpile your crops until it is the market price lends itself to you getting the best dollar value. Maybe you should be doing the same thing with your data. Maybe there's arguments into why you should be thinking long term about the data you're collecting and start investing in the types of open source AI tools that would allow you to build these types of machine learning models, especially if you were doing it in concert with your neighbors, especially if you were doing it as part of your local community co-ops and associations. That's where you can really get the most of the cash crop that is your data moving forward. Because it's not just data for data's sake. If you think about it, the entire food supply chain is moving towards transparency. Traceability has been a trend that's been talked about for quite some time. I really think we're on the verge of it happening on a huge scale. Part of the issue is some of the robots we've seen are going to allow organic farming practices to scale up tremendously. Because if you can have robots de-weeding your land and maintaining your land at hundreds, if not thousands of acres, then all of a sudden organic farming starts to become much more accessible, starts to becoming much more profitable, and you could start seeing not only flood the market, but consumers wanting security, wanting some type of verification that this was available. And so that's where this data will also play a role in terms of verifying your agricultural practices. I mean, we sort of live in a world now where a farmer can farm however they want, and it's their end product that matters. but increasingly the medium is the message, the process is the purpose. How you raised your crops, how you raised your livestock is going to be important to consumers. It's going to be important to the people who buy your products and who sell it or process it for consumers, and they're going to want to have proof. And if there's digital technology, if there's surveillance technology, record keeping technology that makes that possible, there's going to be an emphasis on you to use it and prove that you have that available. But of course, it's not just transparency in the boring data sense, it's YouTube. I mean, let's not forget that agricultural social media is huge. I mean, this is Sask Dutch Kid on YouTube, one of the larger Canadian YouTubers. And there are YouTubers finding success all around the world, some of whom, granted not all, but some of whom are making more money off their YouTube operation than they are their agricultural operation, which, you know, is handy if you got it. But it's also a great way of connecting with consumers, especially if you sell direct to consumers, especially if you're trying to create a brand that you want to be value add, that you want to be premium. Putting out social media is a great form of marketing, a great form of transparency, and a great way to share knowledge with your fellow farmers and to learn from fellow farmers. You know, I personally am a big fan of TikTok. I think ag TikTok or farm TikTok is huge and has tons of potential, especially amongst younger farmers and dairy farmers. So I encourage you, if you haven't checked out TikTok, to take a look at the very least in terms of farm TikTok. And again, has tremendous opportunity when it comes to transparency and tremendous opportunity when it comes to marketing and learning about all the technology that we've talked about today. Now, there did come a question came up in the chat about whether edge cloud would provide more security from hackers than traditional cloud computing. And the answer is it depends. Like, if you had your edge cloud completely disconnected from the internet, then unless that hacker drove up to your property, which I'm assuming your dogs would notice them, then yeah, that's way more secure because you're not on the internet at all. But yes, security is a very legitimate concern. Security, privacy, data protection, not being hacked. I mean, look, there have been issues of the Chinese government hacking farmers and farm organizations to get advanced crop data and try to, you know, beat commodities markets in terms of future pricing. So security is a huge issue, and that's why sometimes the cloud isn't the best idea. But it also speaks to literacy, but it also speaks to why having a partner makes sense. You know, this is why I do like AgExpert. And I do think that as a type of software, it goes a long way to using these types of tools in a way that benefits you in the sense that it gives you functionality. But then you've got a partner in FCC, you've got a partner in AgExpert that allows them to manage the security side, manage the privacy side. But with that said, there's also lots of open source solutions. You know, FarmOS, for example, is free and open source software that's meant to manage all aspects of a farm's operation. And it's part of a larger community called Farm Hack that produces a wide range of free and open source software tools that people use. Now, I tend to write about this stuff on a website I run that features smart farm news and research. It's valley.farm or news.valley.farm, where I post information about some robots and free and open source software information. But, you know, fundamentally, what I've tried to do today, and here's a quick plug. So obviously I wasn't using PowerPoint. I was using today's software called OBS Studio. And OBS Studio is what the kids use to stream video games and to put up content on twitch.tv. I've been enjoying it for the virtual presentation sense, but I also like it because it allows me, you know, when I'm Zoom calling with my family, to show them our flock or to show them the goats. So, you know, there's actually a lot of YouTubers who stream their farm chores, who stream the morning chores, or who stream the evening chores. So you could use OBS Studio as a way to either share with your customers what you're doing in terms of, you know, how you're taking care of your animals or how you're fixing up your heavy equipment, or just as a way to educate and connect with the marketplace as a whole. And all these tools are free. And they all provide really an opportunity for those who are curious, for those who want to learn, to really digitize their farm. And so the idea of using technology is really one of literacy, of getting on a learning curve and making the most of the tools that are available so that you use the tool rather than have the tool use you. And that's kind of your relationship to data. That's kind of the status of your digital barn and the extent to which your digital barn has the right equipment, has the right capacity, has the right security to allow you to make the most of the internet, especially as agriculture becomes more digitized and automated and creates a brave new world of technology. Of course, I'm curious to hear any questions or any ideas, any provocations you would have as well. So maybe we could spend a few moments with some questions or some thoughts.
All right. Wow. Great stuff, Jesse. I'm telling you, I'm sure glad we're recording this session, and I think a lot of other people are too, so that like when it comes to technology and me, I have to go through it really slow. So I'm going to go back through this and it's like, oh, wait, he said that word. Let's slow down. What was that word again? Because and I think a lot of people maybe feel that way about technology, is that it can be a bit overwhelming because it might be the largest topic on planet Earth. So before we get to the Q&A though, let's have a quick peek. We'll just sort of take a breath here and we'll take a peek at what John has been busy doing there. And there we go. Oh my goodness, look at that. He's actually, that's really cool, actually. So this is, for those who've tuned in a little bit late, John has joined us from the Sketch Effect in Nashville. And what he does is he's essentially visually mapping. He's drawing as Jesse is talking. And it sort of reminds me, it's actually really cool because I have done this before with a speech where instead of memorizing something or try to remember it, I create images and I put it in rooms of my house and all this kind of stuff. And that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool stuff we're looking at right there. Very creative. And for those who are interested, by the way, this final product will be sent to everybody who is registered here today. Very cool stuff there, John. Oh, look at that. We got the chicken and all right. There's a lot of minutia there too that you need to be able to zoom in on and have a look at. So we will catch up with that again at the end of the program. Okay, so let's just do a little bit of Q&A. You know, maybe the biggest piece of this, Jesse, is, first of all, I honestly don't know how you do this because, as I said, technology might be the largest topic on the planet. And if it's true, as IBM saying that by about 2020, that there's some sectors that knowledge is doubling every 12 hours, how in the world do you keep up with this? And I guess maybe the more pertinent question is, how can we tune in to some learning that is relevant to us? It's a huge topic. Like any suggestions as to where, I mean, aside from anybody who has a 15-year-old, that's a really great place to start. 15-year-old boy or girl or niece or nephew, because that's how my phone gets fixed and all that. But any thoughts about the whole?
I think that's a brilliant point to start with, that this is how you keep young kids engaged in farming, right? This is how you foster a return to intergenerational agriculture, because there was a period where we were losing younger generations to city centers. They were leaving agriculture. And one of the recurring themes at the robotics conference is that kids are coming back big time because they're excited about robotics. They're excited about technology, and it gives them an opportunity to be valued on the farm for their knowledge rather than be always dismissed as the young whippersnapper or the kid who knows nothing. So it sort of gives them a way in which their own knowledge can be valued. But to go to your larger question of how do you keep up, it's almost a trick question, because the answer is social media. Right? The irony is that social media is the most powerful learning technology ever invented by humanity, while it's also the most powerful distraction and the biggest junk food, right? So on the one hand, it can easily distract you for an hour and waste that time. But if you're focused, if you have a purpose, there's nothing more efficient in terms of gaining knowledge, especially about bleeding edge ag technology, because you're connecting with farmers. right? It's
Yeah.
usually not a sales guy. It's usually not a dealer rep. It's usually someone just like you who's using the technology, who's seen all the flaws, who's had issues with the bugs, and that allows you to really cut to the chase and learn the most. And again, it takes a discipline because there's so much entertainment. There's so many things that could suck up your time. But if you're focused on it as an educational tool, if you connect with other farmers who don't want to waste your time, but who also want to focus on productivity and profitability, you can build a powerful intelligence network in which you're teaching each other, in which you're helping each other kind of stay abreast of what's new. And in that sense, it's many hands make a lighter load. It's like raising a barn that if you have enough people helping you out, it actually becomes a relatively straightforward task.
And it's a great tool, as you mentioned, the social side of this, because even if there are, farmers on this particular connection here today, and maybe you've got a blog that you follow that is specific to some of this ag technology, it really helps to narrow down the vast array of technology and information that's out there, and so that the learning becomes something doable. I see that we've got another question. You obviously touched on an interest point. There's another question about the edge cloud, and they're just asking you to maybe elaborate a little bit more. Where can we find it, and a little bit more about that?
So on the one hand, if you just put into Google Edge Cloud, you will find a lot of stuff that talks about the idea. But the concept is ignore the internet. Pretend that your farm is the only internet that matters, and and then you use technology to extend the internet across your farm, to extend the Wi-Fi access, to extend the Ethernet access. I mean, for example, on my farm, I have a wireless link between my house, where the main internet connection is, and then my drive shed. And then from the drive shed, I've literally run Ethernet cable along my fence line to the barn, to a pole barn in the back of my property, so that in each case, I'm putting up access points so that there's Wi-Fi, I'm adding cameras. So part of edge computing, edge cloud computing, is you just ignore the internet and you focus on extending the internet across your property. The other thing I did is I started running Linux servers, which are free software, free and open source servers, and I ran them on old Pentium computers. So these are old computers that I had just lying around the house. And so that's what has my video recordings, and that's what has my drone mapping software, and that's what has the management software I use to sort of keep track of the stuff we're doing, and it's all local. So none of that has to depend on the internet. None of that requires the internet. So part of it is if you just Google Edge Cloud. The other is to look up Ubiquity or Ubiquity Networking Gear, because they're the company that makes this relatively cheap. And the other is to just think creatively. Just say, I don't care about the rest of the world. I care about my property or my farming operations. How can I make the internet between my buildings or between my fields as fast as possible? So that way you can share data between each other, or share data between buildings, or be able to watch your video monitors throughout the property. At that point, the rest of the internet doesn't matter, insofar as that everything you need is where you need it on your property.
Yeah. There's a question here about somebody who's got some lambing coming up in about a month and a half. And just a quick question, where did you get the equipment for the video monitoring? That's probably a pretty easy one.
Yeah, there's a lot of vendors. I use the Ubiquity gear only because it was a plug and play with the networking gear. But you can use a Raspberry Pi. A Raspberry Pi can be turned into a high definition camera for like $60 max. And then it doesn't matter if it gets destroyed. You can have a bunch of them. I mean, there's all sorts of ways. There's all sorts of free and open source software that make that kind of video surveillance easy. I mean, Ubiquity's plug and play. So if you don't mind spending the money, it's the most user friendly, and it can be done all in the edge cloud or all done locally. So, I mean, the problem with Google Nest and Amazon and some of the other big companies is they all require a fast internet connection. They all require cloud computing. So Ubiquity, you don't need to do that. And there's lots of local systems you don't need to do it. But if you're feeling courageous, Google Raspberry Pi camera, and you'll find recipes, how-tos on the internet that allow you to build your own for really quite cheap. And then you could even add AI that will do image recognition and monitor the birth and monitor their health in really fantastic ways. I mean, I'd start looking at if there's any other farmers who are using similar technology, because they may already be developing that kind of software that you could share with them.
Nice. This is a bit of a subjective question, and but they're asking, if they have the option to upgrade their internet, what would be a minimum needed? Now, again, it depends on what we're doing. If you're sending a lot of data up or you're pulling a lot of data down, but at a minimum, any sort of a idea of what they should have?
So right now, the government of Canada standard, it's much more an ideal than a standard, because unfortunately most of us are nowhere near it. Is what's called 50 down, 10 up, or 50 megabits per second down, 10 megabits up. I personally feel that you want like 50-50, or 100-100, or 500-500. I mean, Barn B4RN, that British farmers co-op I mentioned, they have 1,000 down and 1,000 up. So
Oh,
they're like way, way ahead of us. I mean,
wow.
really, the more the better. You're investing in the future. 50-10 is the bare minimum, but if you can get better than that, great. And again, it's partly a cooperative effort. So talk to your neighbors, talk to the people in your area, because if you can pool your resources, that's where it can also get cheap. Especially if you have heavy equipment to like dig
Hmm.
trenches, or to be able to run it across your own land. If you get creative, the actual cost of internet can plummet while the speeds skyrocket.
Wow. You know what? I guess we promised to be done at the top of the hour, and there's still more questions coming in. I want to just leave you with one last question, I guess, unless I get permission to go much longer. But, I feel like we've seen a trend in rural Canada over the last number of years of the exodus to the urban centers for jobs and such. And I think two things have happened, and I'd be interested in your comment on this. With the gradual, and I'll emphasize the gradual um, uh, implementation of the infrastructure for broadband in the rural areas. And of course, this year, COVID. Suddenly, and you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but all of a sudden I'm seeing a whole lot more possibilities of rural Canada becoming an economic engine. Is that possible?
It's happening. I've been for years saying the future is rural. I put my money where my mouth is, and I left downtown Toronto and moved into the country myself. Part of it's quality of life. People are realizing what farmers have known all along, that life is just better in the country. And part of it's the internet, that a lot of professionals, a lot of people who have the means able to do so. And whether it's the pandemic, which is a huge factor. I mean, I live in the Ottawa Valley in Eastern Ontario, and our property prices are shooting through the roof because lots of
Mhm.
government people are now able to work from home. So they're all starting to find rural properties. And micro farming is starting to become viable, right? I mean, here in Eastern Ontario, most farmers are part time as it is, because they need a day job in order to support their agricultural habit. Well, increasingly, and it's partly robots, but also partly the nature of which agriculture is becoming more accessible, and the knowledge around agriculture is becoming more accessible, we are definitely seeing a swing of the pendulum back to rural communities. We need appropriate public policy to support it and enable it,
Yeah.
broadband being a big one. But I do think the future is rural, and I think both on a quality of life, but an economic opportunity perspective, we're going to see a lot of exciting opportunities in rural communities. But again, it comes back to internet, and I
Yeah.
think that's where a lot of the farming communities, a lot of the rural communities who are thinking about the future are going to start laying fiber in their ditches, are going to start laying fiber along their poles, are going to start running berry fiber in their fields when they put in drainage, when they do anything, because it's anticipating those future needs that's really going to create a lot of economic and social opportunities in rural communities.
Well, a great big thank you and a big virtual round of applause for you, Jesse. I appreciate all of your insight here today. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
And so, one last time, we're going to check in with John and just see how he has been. There we go. He's been working away there. I'm really fascinated because the monitor I'm looking at here is not quite as clear and it's about 3 feet away. So, I really want to see in detail some of what is there, but really appreciate the creative touch that John has given to this presentation here today. And as I mentioned, you will receive, if you registered for this event, the final product that John has put together here today. And appreciate the color that this has added to our event here today. For those of you who are going to stick around and would like to ask questions about the AgExpert software, I'll just remind you to look for the lounge on the main menu, and you'll find the AgExpert Lounge that interests you there. In a few days, you're going to receive a link to the recording of this event, which is a really good thing, so we can go back through, because Jesse really covered a lot of practical stuff there, and just to go slow it down and absorb it just a little bit. And you can also rewatch that yourself. You can, forward it to friends and family if you like. That'll come out in a couple of days. In addition, you're going to receive an email with an evaluation. Really appreciate you filling that out. It helps FCC plan for future events. In that email also, you're going to remember I mentioned there's a code, a discount code for $100 off the AgExpert Premium. And just an FYI on that, code expires December 31st of this year. So that's what, a little over 2 weeks from now. Okay, so for those of you who've been following along over the last couple of months, we've had a number of these events every 2 weeks. We're going to take a break for a couple of weeks for the holidays, but we are going to return January the 12th. So mark that on your calendar, your paper calendar, your Google Calendar, whatever you use. January the 12th, Dr. Tom Deans will be with us. He's going to do a deep dive into the 6 estate planning ideas that successful farm families master. And so to register for that, it's the same drill as before at fcc.ca/events. And that's it. Take a deep breath. On behalf of Farm Credit Canada, thanks for loaning us some of your valuable time. And you know what? Make it a great holiday. Bye for now.